Thank you for joining the session with Port Logistics Group today. We'll be talking about onboarding best practices, things that they've learned and continue to work on. And before we jump in, let me introduce myself and InstaWork. I'm Frances Liu. I lead marketing here at InstaWork. And then for those who don't know, InstaWork is a flexible staffing solution in the warehouse and logistics space. We ensure workers show up prepared and on time with a 90% fill rate and less than 3% no-show rate. And we do that in a combination of using technology and a high-touch support services to make that happen. Just a little quick overview, we have over 600,000 people who've signed up to look for work on our platform, and we get about 30,000 people who sign up every month. And we're about in 20 metro areas right now. I think we're probably growing already, so that's already outdated, but all throughout the US. And so for us, we started hosting these sessions because we've heard from our customers they like learning from each other. It's an opportunity to connect across similar businesses and industries across a lot of the different problems you're all struggling around. And so I'm really grateful to invite Michael and Jessica here. They were very gracious to share their own learning experiences. And so this session is really for you. I'll start it off by asking them a few questions about their journey, but we'll be leaving ample time for you to either share questions of your own, to dig deeper, maybe even share your own experience and see how it relates. So we hope that it'll be a really good conversation and dialogue. And so with that, I'll kick it off to the two people that you've all come to learn from. So first, Jessica and Michael, may you introduce yourself and your responsibilities? Maybe we can kick it off with Jessica.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Carrera. I am the HR director over at Port Logistics Group. I've been with the company now for about 3 years. And, my roles and responsibilities within Port Logistics Group are really centered around learning and development, talent management, creation of the value proposition, and ultimately designing and enhancing the employee experience throughout the employee life cycle. So I'm really excited today to share with you all some of the onboarding best practices that we've learned and what we've learned from, and share all of that with you so that you guys can gain some value out of that as well. So Frances, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. And Mike?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Vendetti. I'm the Vice President of Operations with Port Logistics, like Jessica. I've been with the organization now about 3 years. Frances used the word learning experiences, and, I want to convey at the onset that by no means do we have this all figured out. There's things that we've tried that have worked well. There's things that we've tripped over. And there's things that we're still a work in progress on. And, one of the things that, Frances will touch on later, but you heard Jessica touch on things like talent management, value propositions, enhancing the employee experience. Well, in the past, that used to be just an HR function. But in reality, those lines continue to be more and more blurred with operations as well. So, and we'll touch on some of that as we go. So thank you, Frances, for having us, and look forward to the dialogue, because I'm looking forward to hearing what other people are doing as well.
Great. And for those who don't know PLG well, Jessica, would you mind sharing a bit of context in terms of how big the operations are, how expansive that is?
So we currently have 17 facilities all across the country, and they're strategically positioned among all of the major gateways. So we have facilities in California, in Washington, New Jersey, Florida, and then in between we have some in recently Columbus, Ohio, and Savannah, Georgia. So it's split up into East region and West region, and really it's neat because throughout the whole entire organization we have a good 50-50 mix of about 50% temp staff labor, and then another 50% of full-time employees. So, off peak season, we're at about, 3,000, give or take. And then during peak season, that number quickly jumps up to like 4,000, even a little over 4,000. So Yeah, so it's a pretty big operation, and so we're excited to, lead the way in some of the things that we've learned. And Mike plays a critical role in the operations because a good 60 to 70% of the operations is housed out of California. So
Great, thank you for that context. And then maybe just to jump it back to Mike, when you first started at PLG a few years ago, can you describe some of the things that you observed in the operations that maybe pointed towards onboarding as an area of opportunity?
Yeah, I'm not going to refer to it, Francis, as what I called it in the past. I know that made you cringe. So the reality is, like anything in any operation, the one thing that will bring challenges is a lack of consistency, right? It doesn't matter what it is, right? Whether you're loading a truck, unloading a truck, picking an order, or in this case, as we're talking today, onboarding. The one thing that I found, and I'm sure Jessica saw it even more than I did, was we were completely consistently inconsistent, I guess would be the right way to phrase it, with how we brought people in. Some buildings did a wonderful job, and there was a nice hand holding all the way through. And other buildings, from the time they basically had their finger on the clock to scan in, they were on their own. And that caused a great deal of challenge.
Mm-hmm. And why is that?
Well, I mean, look, to date myself with this old commercial, you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. And at least in California, and I'm not sure where the folks are that are on this call are calling in from, but I'm sure it's very similar. We're all fighting for the same labor. And, the reality is we have a very big, what I would call hockey stick in needs, especially from September to December. Mm-hmm. The reality is, if in our business, at least in the 3PL business, as I affectionately like to tell people, although we think we're really good and unique, the reality is everybody's got buildings, everybody's got rack, everybody's got forklifts, systems, and everything else. The real value proposition, as Jessica alluded to, is the folks within the four walls. And if you can get them up to speed and reduce that turnover and increase that retention, at the risk, I don't want this to sound too altruistic, because there's a real business reason that we want to do this. And, mm-hmm. and it just helps not only the customer experience, but it helps the profitability as well.
Yeah. That's a really great point. And so then it sounds like you came into an operations with lots of different practices happening on a local level. Jessica, you oversee all of these different locations. And so yeah, I'm sure part of that consistency and driving that consistency is a partnership on your side. And so how would you describe maybe some of the core tenets in your onboarding process today?
Right. So, a lot of it is feedback from the local HR business partners assigned to support the various different client groups across the country. And so a lot of what we do is we break up the onboarding process into, what I would call two segments. First segment is the pre-onboarding. And so that is really geared towards building excitement for that new hire. Hey, we're so excited to have you on the team. Our CEO created a welcome video. It's about a 5-minute video, but I mean, it's personalized because we send it to the new hire and, just as a way of saying, hey, we're so excited that you're here. Here's a message from the CEO welcoming you, in the next few days to come. And another part of the pre-onboarding process that we do too is we give them a lot of the practical knowledge that they need to have up front. And one of the main things that we've learned in sort of going back and, evaluating what can we improve on is, benefits. Benefits is a big decision that it isn't solely the new hire that's making that decision. It's, a lot of the times it's a spouse or it's a dependent. And so giving them all of that information up front to really shop and watch that 25, 30-minute tutorial. I know it sounds really long, but, their family gets to watch it and they really get to be loaded and ask the right questions on what we call launch day, which is new hire orientation. And so fast forward day one, they're with us. And we do a launch day. And really that launch day is a scripted, 2 to 3 hour session that covers things like policies and procedures, all the not so fun stuff, but the things that need to be covered with almost everyone. We dedicate a good portion of that to what we call your wallet, right? So things that are geared towards like payroll, 401k, benefits. And then we usually open it up and close it off again with intros. And we try to do gamified training. And so what we do is at the end of launch day, we check for learning effectiveness. And part of the way we do that is, we pose questions to the audience and we sort of, create a game out of it and ask, so, what did you learn? So when do you have to sign up for open enrollment? Who is your dedicated HR person? And oh, by the way, what are the core values? Because we try to capture the core values on the front end so that it's a constant message all throughout that employee's life cycle. And then of course, once we were done and we're wrapped up, we hand them over to our safety team. And then the safety does, all of the safety training needs and everything else that's required at the local level. And of course, depending on the role and the position of the new hire that we're onboarding. And so, that's a very high level overview, but that's sort of what we try to do. And it's a fluid program, right? Because we're always looking for continuous improvement and we're looking for feedback, throughout different touch points of that employee's, entrance when they're joining the team. And then, a few weeks later to sort of ensure that the program is always fresh and it's relevant and it's changing based off of what, our policies are at that time.
Thank you. I think a few things that stood out when you shared was how onboarding didn't start at when they walked through the door. It starts when they agreed to it, right? So you're already getting them excited, not just on the tactical elements of paperwork, but the culture and the value and why they're joining. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think the second bit is like, how do you make like your onboarding experience interactive? And use that validation point, because oftentimes, it's such a repeat out, like you're sort of, confirming what's really sinking in, right, and sticking. So that's great. Rob, you have your hand up. Thank you for using that Zoom feature. Do you want to share your question?
There you go. I didn't know the protocol. I figured I'd just use the technology. So Jessica, thank you, and Michael for that overview. I'm wondering if you can share any light. It depends on the level of employee you're bringing in, and I'm sure you could bifurcate it a bunch of different ways. But doing the pre-onboarding and the personalized videos and using benefits as a differentiator, can you give a sense of before and after doing these things? Like at a certain level of the employee you're bringing in, what was the difference in terms of length of tenure, or what was the benefit of doing this? Is it helping to have people stay longer with your company? Can you give a sense of like, what was the payoff for doing these things? Because they all sound great. What's the return you've gotten on it so far?
Right. So, I think right off the gate, the return on investment is the fact that their higher levels of productivity, you can really shorten the time that it takes somebody to really learn policies and procedures and then really get them to know what's important, the productivity out on the floor, the position, the roles and responsibilities. How we got to determine that is, through these, unfortunately, exit interviews. It's a rear view mirror approach. We were learning because people were leaving, they were unsatisfied. But really, ultimately, it allowed us to create focus groups and find out what can we do on the front end to capture this important information. And I drew benefits as one example, but there are other things along the way that we realized, these are things that employees need more than an hour time to really talk about. Benefits was one of them. But, things like, when's my payday? Where do I go for the direct deposit? We just realized we really got to move away from paper transaction type of forms, and we really just moved to an electronic self-service model. And so everything that we do with like, I-9s, payroll, direct deposit, all that stuff that comes with the new hire's first day of paperwork, it's all done electronically. And that has helped us not only shorten the amount of time that they're spending with HR, but it also allows them more time out to really get to spend that one-on-one time with their what we call on-the-job coach, which is in essence is their dedicated trainer that's going to show them the inner workings of the department and the position and the roles and the responsibilities. So.
Yeah, thank you.
Great question, Rob. And Jessica, do you mind touching, you mentioned, you have about 50% that actually are temp workers in your facilities. And so how does that onboarding process differ between your full-time versus temp, if at all?
Well, it does, right? Because our temp workers they belong to the agency, they're agency employees. So really we ask the agency representatives to mirror that same onboarding process, but at the local branch level. So temp workers will receive a similar experience, but it will be done at their agency office. And really where we take over is day one, where they show up to work and we assign them to that welcome buddy. And that person, in essence, goes over that welcome checklist. Here's the restrooms, here's the time clocks, here's where you go for, if you have a help desk technician need, here's what you do. And then they get handed over to their trainer. And so we take over from the moment where they show up to work with the expectation that all of that onboarding and pre-onboarding stuff was taken care of, at the local agency office.
Got it. Thank you. Moving on maybe to Mike, you had mentioned when we were chatting about how onboarding is such a tight partnership between HR and operations. Can you just describe how HR and operations, what are the different roles and responsibilities that as it relates to the onboarding process, and why is that so important for both sides to be involved?
Well, and the one thing that I wanted to convey here is also, this isn't a one size fits all, right? It has to work for your organization and what you do. But for us, the one thing we're wrestling with is, historically, we would, I don't want to say treat temps differently, but the way we may have incorporated them, the way we may have managed them with our own folks was a little different. And then, so what we found from the whole process of not only making sure that our team, our supervisors, our managers are getting the right skill sets and training and development to be effective, to be able to manage those interactions with the folks out on the floor. Historically, we would look at HR to say, look, we're having interpersonal issues with so-and-so, you go handle it. Well, Jessica's philosophy and the HR team's philosophy is, well, no, we're going to teach you how to manage that and be able to partner with you. And also to work closely with our teams operationally. I have HR sit in on, as many of the calls operationally as they can, because I want them to understand what's going on in the operation week to week, because it also helps them stay ahead of the curve on what are the skill sets maybe that we need to be adapting to be better suited for what's coming down the road in 2021, 22, 23. Mm-hmm. So it's much more of I say partnership, but it also lends itself to much more proactive relationship versus being reactive and always playing catch up.
Yeah, and what kind of difference have you seen with your sort of warehouse frontline supervisors? Mm-hmm. Having more of that ownership to address issues like that.
Well, again, some like everything, right? Some are better than others. But one of the things that Jessica introduced to our region, well, actually to the company, was getting what I would call the building blocks of training instituted. And what I mean by that is we brought in an outside company called Udemy, and we sat down and mapped out what are those skill sets, competencies that a good supervisor needs to have. That's kind of your foundational piece. Okay, then beyond that, okay, as an ops manager, maybe what do we need to layer in over the top of that? So for lack of a better term, and Jessica can add more color to this, but it's kind of a learning track, if you will, that mm-hmm. the soups, the ops managers are now progressing through to be better equipped to deal with some of this.
That's great. So you're really supporting them, making them effective, and then in part that just creates a more consistent experience for every person who's come in through the door.
As much as we can, yes.
As much as you can.
Yes.
In an ideal world.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Dan, you have your hand raised. You want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you. So question on our end is, we're noticing our associates that many are starving for mentorship or career path, or just paving a way for what that looks like in longevity. Whether they remain an associate or a path to permanent employment. Is PLG doing, what efforts is PLG doing as far as mentorship or coaching or job leveling when it comes to, hey, you have Joe Schmo who needs to make more, whatever the compensation looks like, to get their skill set, assuming they're a good fit, character, chemistry, core values. Is there job loving that's going on? Is there that type of mentorship, both at the permanent employee level as well as an associate level?
Yeah, and so Dan, I'm gonna, at the risk of punting this over to Jessica, I'm gonna let her touch on this because this kind of aligns with that core learning track, if you will. So Jessica, did you want to touch on that?
Right. So, Dan, we try to build what's called, several different touch points within 30, 60, 90 days of onboarding somebody. And, assuming that this person meets the criteria of, they have the right skill sets, the right attitude, everything's great. We really create that dialogue on the beginning to really find out, what is this person looking for? I mean, are they looking for full-time employment? Do they want to transition from being a temp to a full-time? Or are they a lead who really they're looking for that next step in their career to be a supervisor? And so we gather that information within the first 30 days to, in essence, go back to that on-the-job coach and create a roadmap for that person to have a career with us. And their career can start off as a, temp worker, transitioning to a general labor, transitioning to a lead person, but, really catering to that particular individual, because everybody's career path looks a little differently, but certainly we have templates in place that can say that we can utilize for somebody who wants to transition between an hourly lead to a salaried supervisor professional level. And Udemy is, sort of like LinkedIn Learning, is a great tool because it's an online resource and they get to enhance their skills on the job. They get to do it through their mobile phone or through a PC, or certainly they can do much more above and beyond while they're at home. But then additionally, they're assigned to certain subject matter experts within the organization that are great at what they do. And they get to learn from them firsthand, whether we're talking about, evolving or enhancing leadership skills or evolving more of the technical side of things. Those resources are there. It's just a matter of finding who's really interested in taking that next step in their career, and us basically, enhancing that and in making that possible for them. So.
Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Great. So Jessica, maybe I wanted to double or click in something that you mentioned about like the pre-onboarding. You had your CEO go and share that video, right? And I think you talked about how while you were there, your company actually went through a whole refresh of your company values. Can you tell a little bit more about why you guys did that, how you did it, and what you've seen as a benefit? I think it's one of those things, kind of like to Rob's point, where it sounds really great and you want to do it, but sometimes it's hard to measure the impact. And so I would love it for you to share your own experience there.
Right. So when I first started, we had, 6, what I would call mini mission statements. They were values, but they were, in the form of statements. And when we tried to talk about these statements and make awareness to these values that we had, a lot of people were really lost and they really didn't know what our values were. And so last year in January, the executive team did a leadership retreat, and basically they used that time to refresh our core values. And when they came back from that retreat, they relaunched our core values. And in essence, they became from statements to words. And so now our core values today are very, true to what we do. They're very simplistic words. It's ownership, stewardship, authenticity, healthy debate, trust, respect, and empathy. And the goal in last year's Leadership Summit, as we unveiled or refreshed these new core values, was to ensure that this was not a top-down, initiative, but it was also bottom-up. And so last year was a great year to sort of kick these values off, refresh them. And we try to capture that in the beginning in the onboarding process as well, but we do a lot of other things during the life cycle of an employee to just constantly keep these values top of mind for everyone. And so these values are incorporated into programs like Employee of the Month. Employee of the Months are geared towards some of the values. We do storytelling, we do cards where it has the word of that value. And if a manager sees another employee or if a colleague sees a fellow, coworker embodying one of these values, they write a story and we, announce that story in a town hall meeting. This year, when we had our virtual leadership summit, we gave 7 awards for, you're talking about what, a little over 1,500 employees. And we gave 1 award for stewardship and 1 award for respect, because again, it's us wanting to remind everybody that these values are in essence what define us as an organization. And we want to continue to just constantly embed those values in every opportunity that we can. And so why did we do it? Because we believe that the initial statement values were not as impactful as simple words like trust and respect, where people can really resonate and tie stories to those values.
And what kind of impact have you seen as it relates to your warehouse, like experience or productivity or retention?
Definitely, I would say productivity in this and engagement because of the programs that are tied to the values. But Mike, I'm going to kick this one over to you because I'm sure you see much more of this out on the floor.
Yeah, it's a great question. Rob brings up the age-old question, and that is, how do you measure some of this, right?
Mhm.
It's kind of like when you walk through a building or an operation and somebody says, well, describe the culture. And it's hard to put your finger on it, right? But you know when it's there and you kind of know when it isn't too. Going back to Jessica's point, we had by far our best year. And I know it's hard to, in a pandemic year, but we had our best year ever in 2020 by a mile. I mean, it was inconceivable. If you had asked me this a year ago, March, that we would have been saying that, I would have said it was impossible. Now, is that always because of the values? No, but what we've tried to do is take essentially those words, which are really behaviors, right? Trust, respect, healthy debate, and tie them to what we do from a productivity standpoint. For example, I do continuous improvement training with our folks, with our leadership teams. The one thing I try to reinforce there is you can't have a culture of continuous improvement if you don't have trust, if you don't have the ability to have healthy debate and challenge existing processes. So tying that back to those core values and then using those as the stepping stones for getting the kind of behavior we want, not just in the words, but in the actions and the environment that we're trying to create, have been astronomical. We're not, as an organization, and Jessica may disagree, but we are not what I would call in the top 90th percentile compensation-wise. So we have to be able to offer more to our folks than just throwing money at a problem. Our CEO cringes every time, that's one of his things. You can't just keep throwing money at a problem. Well, the reality is we want to be competitive. We're never going to be maybe at that 90th or 100th percentile. But if we can offer other things in the environment, like those town hall meetings where we give out medals, for example, to somebody who gets recognized for embodying one of the core values, that goes a long way. Now, Rob, to your question, how do I measure that? It's probably a little hard to do, but I know it means a lot to the folks.
So it sounds like you're getting some feedback, at least anecdotally, and then you're seeing the behavior changes, and the indirect impact. That's great, James.
Absolutely.
I saw that you have a question. You want to?
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. James Darwin with Legacy Supply Chain. I have a question about going back earlier. Video is sent out in the pre-boarding process. What platform is that video sent out? Is that part of your ATS system or your human resource system?
No, this is YouTube. So we send out a YouTube link because usually we find that works with, on your phone, on your smartphone device, and on your regular PC. So we don't have it tied to our HRIS system or anything else. And we find that works well with most applications that new hires have.
So whatever email address that they put on their application, then you would just
Right.
push YouTube.
Right. And it usually what we'll do is we'll ask them, what's your preferred method of communication? Is it email or is it SMS text messaging? And we make sure that we get their authorization in advance, and we'll cater to what communication method makes the most sense for that individual.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. I think that's a great idea.
Great. So we talked about sort of the first day, right? The pre-boarding, the onboarding, and then I think the training doesn't stop kind of for day one. It sort of continues on. And so, Mike, do you want to describe how the ramp up process works? Once they're on the floor, and I know specifically you talked about the on the job coach or trainer. How do you use that resource effectively as part of that onboarding program?
Well, so at the beginning, you had asked me where we kind of had our challenges. And one of the things was what I would call lack of consistency on onboarding. But what we also had was a lack of consistency in just basic processes. For those that are familiar with the lean lexicon, I really am adamant about not using standard operating procedures because it brings up connotations of binders and collecting dust on somebody's bookshelf. We really try to put together standard work templates. So a guy or gal coming in the building, getting married up to a mentor, sponsor, buddy, whatever the term you necessarily want to use, that person's going to get trained on a process the same exact way. So James, Dan, Rob, and I apologize, I'm just looking at all three of you on the screen. You will all be trained in the process, not the way Sally interpreted the process. And so we're trying to eliminate that variation as much as we can along the way. We've also found by doing that, it serves two purposes. One, we have a more of a reasonable sense now that whoever's coming through the process is getting trained the right way. Number two, what it also forces us to do is occasionally go back and look at our processes to say, whoever that mentor they may come back a month or two later and go, you know what? I'm kind of looking at how I'm training this, and then we've kind of evolved and we haven't maybe documented this. How do we go back and scribe this and make sure that this is now memorialized as the process going forward? So it really serves a couple of purposes there.
That's great. So it's not that those mentors don't just help on the floor in the moment, but really help drive that consistency back and provide that feedback for across the different departments or locations.
It forces us to keep, for lack of a better term, that PDCA cycle in mind, that we have to keep going back and looking at our processes as well.
Yeah. And how do you find the right trainer? Is that part of a defined track that you guys have as career development, or how does that come about? How do you make sure that person is, has the right skills to do so?
That's the one area that, because what we find is, and I'm sure everybody on this call can relate, just because you can do the job doesn't necessarily make you the best trainer. And so we're still trying to find that right mix of what makes the ideal trainer, right? This guy or gal may be a good performer, but boy, they can communicate very effectively. They're very detailed with following up and being able to observe and give good feedback, versus somebody who may be a superstar in performance, but they're just right of Attila the Hun when it comes to giving feedback, right? And they're not very constructive out on the floor. So we're trying to find that right balance too of what the ideal trainer should look like. Got
it. Jessica, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think to Mike's point, that's one of those things that we are evolving, and it's an ongoing process, and it's taking on many different shapes and forms. And so we're looking to refine, a selection process for our on-the-job trainers and mentors.
Interesting. Maybe this is a good question to ask the group, since Mike was looking for feedback anyways. Anybody else here have like a buddy, a mentor, sponsor system, and what are the things that you look for or have in place to make it a successful program?
Our organization has tried, but we just cannot get any traction.
Can I ask a question on that? Can I ask a question on the question? So James, just really quick, what have you seen? Like what causes you to kind of do that stop-start thing with it?
You know, I truly believe it's, everybody can relate to this. You know, we really have the momentum rolling, and then something else happens. So everybody's attention's diverted, and everybody's priorities kind of change, and then it drops. You know, I think it sounds like with your organization, there was a commitment top down to get this done, and, you know, you wrote it out. And that's always finding a reason why, you know, there's other higher priority things to tackle.
You know, it's funny you say that. You know, that does not mean we don't get challenged with this. I've spent the last month in an operation in another part of the country that I'm not necessarily responsible for. But the one thing I noticed was what you described, James, is it went from kind of a planning and a commitment to more of a firefight, and all of a sudden everything becomes reactionary, and you know, we can't take Sally or John off the floor to help invest in being that training person because that'll set us back even further. And you know, the only thing I can say is to anybody is, if you've lived the downside to these bad scenarios operationally, I can only say that the time you spend up front to do that pays for itself many times over with all the other things, as I'm sure you know, James.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Jennifer, I noticed that you have your hand up. Do you have something to add, or you have a question?
I do. I was just wondering how it is that when you said you have all of the locations that you have, we have a similar number of locations, and how you make sure that they are all following the same process and procedures that you guys have put in place for this program, because that's kind of the inconsistently inconsistent is some of the problems that we have.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. We host monthly what we call train the trainer sessions, and we use those 1-hour sessions to basically ensure that it's a collaborative cross-functional effort between PLG HR, operations, and then also the on-site agency representatives as well, because we're all touching different points of this onboarding process. And so it's once a month, let's make sure that, you know, what are we learning, what are we not? And it also becomes sort of like a focus group. And we use those opportunities to get that feedback, improve the process. And sometimes we find that it's limited resources. Sometimes we find that it's people just not knowing, you know, who that dedicated buddy person is or what that welcome checklist is. So once a month, train the trainer sessions, we find that that's the best way to bridge the gap and to try as best as possible to create that consistency among all of the different facilities.
Great, thank you.
Jessica, what I really liked about what you said is that you involve your vendors as well. It's not just an internal thing. And I think like that's sometimes we've like, you know, being on the other side of it, we wish we had more of that involvement and then information up front because we could catch it upstream. So that's really great that you do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, our temp agency employees also have a big impact in our culture, which is why we invite the on-site agency reps to sit at the table when it comes to things like labor planning and, you know, these sort of programs and stuff, because we want to make it inclusive. We don't want to design these programs just solely for PLG employees. We want to make sure that everybody, you know, takes a part of this as well.
That's great. And you had mentioned in our previous conversation, some of the ways that you've changed that consistency or like communication and onboarding across different locations now that you've been somewhat remote. Do you want to share like one or two things that you guys have been able to do to actually take advantage of the fact that people are kind of working everywhere right now?
Yeah. So pre-COVID, we used to be firm believers in the HR team that in order to get that real, launch day experience, you had to physically be in person to have that human element and make sure you create that dialogue. And I think COVID just taught us that, we could really leverage technology and have people from all parts of the country attend a launch day virtually. And as long as we utilize the tools as best as possible to create a similar experience to what it would be in person, we can definitely do so. And as a matter of fact, last week we had a launch day, and it was from people from New Jersey, from Columbus, Ohio, from California. So it was really neat to have everybody from different time zones, different parts of the map, be all together for this launch day session where pre-COVID, we'd be planning schedules. Okay, what HR person is going to cover what facility, who's going to be there, what operations person is going to be there. So I think this is the neat thing about this, that it has taught us that we can really, leverage technology, create efficiencies, and really just streamline what once used to be a very in-person type of program to enhance it with the technology that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure it must be a huge time saver for your team, but it also probably is another way of driving consistency. If one person's talking across the different locations and they're all getting the same message.
Correct.
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? I'll pause right now and see if anybody has questions that maybe they've been sitting on. I have a few more, but want to make sure that you guys get what you want.
This is Jennifer again. I have another quick question. Since you involve your temporary service provider in some of these communications, do you have one or do you have a bunch of them? And then because you have a lot of temps, so just
we do. Good question. So when was it? 2 years ago, Mike, I think it was. We used to have a roster of like 10 agencies that we would draw temp labor from, and I think we realized that is not a good business practice. We're just all over the place. So we did an RFP about 1.5 years ago, and now we only have 2 vendors, and they are our primary, vendors that we source for all temp labor needs. And so when we're talking about all these programs, it's so much easier because it's just 2 reps to go to that we, participate. We ask them to actively take a role in these programs to ensure consistency. And it's twofold, right? It isn't just for the benefit of PLG, but it's also for their benefit as well, because they want folks to stay. That's how, they get their earnings as well. And so it's a vested partnership.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Anyone else? All right, well, I'll keep going, but please don't be shy. So I think a few things left. So we touched a little bit about how do you measure impact, right? In terms of both in a quantitative and a qualitative way. Can you guys share a little bit in terms of, like from across the board, how do you do that on your onboarding practices, or maybe around productivity and retention? What are some of the numbers that you see?
I think some KPIs to sort of measure the effectiveness of some of these things. I mean, I'll have Mike take it away, but I'm going to say what I think, and then Mike, you definitely piggyback off that. Engagement. So engagement isn't just a productivity, but I think other forms of engagement is just the punctuality, the attendance of that new hire. How engaged are they? Safety incident rates. We should be able to see, quantified numbers in that. Turnover, I think that's a big one. And then in HR, we measure it through entrance surveys and then stay interviews. And that's not really qualitative as much as it is just getting feedback to get what that employee experience is like. But I'm sure Mike sees it much more on the productivity side of things when it comes to, making sure that we set up somebody for success in day one. So.
Yeah, it's hard in the sense that I've never really gone back and probably measured how quick it took to get somebody up to speed in certain functions prior to this. what I can tell you is that we go from literally, we'll add 50 to 60% more labor in a period of 60 to 90 days over our baseline. If we're not very structured in how we're bringing these folks in, how we're training them, and how we're actually greeting them, training them, and even the planning process with the agencies to make sure we have a good documented plan of how we want to bring people in and when and what roles. I can tell you that it would lend itself to just pure chaos. And so we really had to put in a lot of controls in these areas that frankly we didn't have in the past. And while not perfect, nothing is, it's really helped us take what was a lot of turmoil and bring it down to a manageable level.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of peak season and how you ramp, in addition to just, it sounds like just practicing the motions, so everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing as somebody's new or coming on. When you're bringing on way more folks during that time period, are there other things that you do or you change to handle that ramp?
Well, yeah, I mean, Jessica can talk more about from an onboarding standpoint, but from an operational standpoint, I mean, this year obviously was a complete change, right? Because of the fact that we had to introduce social distancing, things that we would probably be able to do in one shift, we had to now do in two because we couldn't bring the same density into the same areas that we used to. Introducing even outdoor break areas where you could have people without being clustered around each other. Yeah, so 2020 is a year that we probably won't forget. But that's been one of the biggest challenges, because not only doing the work, but we've also, something as basic, and I don't know how many people are in the supply chain business, but something even as basic as unloading a truck. I used to be able to put multiple people into a truck to unload a container. Well, now I couldn't do that. So what did that look like? And what did that mean to our capacity? And how were we going to manage through that as well? So it was very challenging as far as that goes. Yeah.
It sounds like just not only be able to handle the additional volume, but the constraints, right, to keep everybody safe, which is also really great. It's really important that you do.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very hard to sit there and talk about core values and then basically take people's health and well-being and put that on the back burner. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's something that we had to keep, at the forefront of everything we did this past year.
Yeah. We talked a lot about things that worked and the things that you're working on now. Can you share something that didn't work and why? Mike, you're laughing. You can go first.
Oh, you want me to go first?
Something seemed to have popped into your mind.
Well, what didn't work? Probably more things that don't work than do work. And so it's through trial and error. But, the one thing that I've found is that when we try to, for lack of a better term, fast track people through the buildings to get them up to speed, it just, for whatever reason, I mean, it just didn't work. We tried to sit there and say, look, we want to train this new associate on multiple sets of skills so they can be versatile. Well, what we found is that they were really not as good in now multiple skill sets versus being really competent in one. So we had to really take a step back and say, look, let's go back to the original script that we found works. Let's make sure we have a good starting date for folks when they come in. Let's make sure we have the right people greeting them, the right people taking them through, the right people working with them the first 40, 80, 120 hours. And, I wish I could say it was something different than that, but I find that when we got away from some of the basics, that's when things really bit us.
Yeah. Jessica, does something come to mind for you?
No, I'd have to echo that. I think that we saw that more so in peak season where we were pressed for productivity and bringing in temps, and the business demands were there. It was some of it was just staffing. And so when we try to fast track that process, I think we really found ourselves in a situation where, okay, we really got to take a step back here, and what's missing, or how can we improve that, because it's not working. So
Yeah.
This year, Francis, and I'm sure everybody on this call can relate to this, is that, everything that you thought you knew about volume and flow and when things were going to arrive and when they weren't, it went out the window in 2020. And, from the time that containers were getting backed up to the flow of goods. So even information that you used to be able to bank on, even from your customers to plan accordingly, went out the window. And so that was one of the challenges that we had is it was almost like, okay, here's our plan, but we almost needed a plan B and a plan C ready to go, because we could almost bank on plan A was never going to come to fruition.
So it helps then to be prepared, I guess, and to be creative.
Well, as much as we could, as we could, sure.
I'm going to make one more ask. Anybody in the group have anything they want to share or ask? Dan, did you just raise your hand?
I did. Yes,
Yeah.
Thank you. Just more of kind of a dollars question. And I've spoken with Greg and some folks at PLG at length, but how did PLG address, especially in Southern California in mid 2020, the market pay gap that resulted in basically not only not attracting people, but losing people? What did you proactively do something? Did you reactively do something? Did you reward consistency? How was that? Because that was massive for our 3PL operation.
Yeah. So Dan, are you located in Southern Cal as well?
We're located in SoCal, and we're actually a PLG partner under the Whiplash brand.
Oh, terrific. Excellent. Well, so, Dan, one of the things, and again, I hate to go back and I'll keep quoting our CEO about throwing money at a problem, but the one thing, anybody that's familiar with our California labor market, we're in the middle of a, for lack of a better word, a minimum wage progression, right? And I think that's probably what Dan is referring to, is that we had two issues. One, obviously, was the entry-level jobs where the wage scale was going up. But then you had to deal with the pressure, what we call wage compression, right? The guy or gal that was doing more of the high-end job, and now that gap between them and the starting job was starting to bump together. So we did have to tweak some of the pay scale a little bit for some of those higher level jobs, as Dan was referring to, some of maybe the equipment drivers or some other things. Did we necessarily chase the top value like maybe what Amazon would do? No. But what we did try to do is when we recruited people or brought people in, and Jessica can speak to this, we tried to let people know that you weren't just here as a hired gun. We wanted you to come in, but we also wanted you to come in and stay, and that there was a career progression for you versus, hey, we're going to back up the Brinks truck for 90 days and pay you all these signing bonuses like Amazon was doing and whatnot. And God, I hope nobody from Amazon's on this call, so no disrespect intended. But the reality is we weren't going to do that, and we couldn't do that. But we also wanted to let people know that when the dust settles 90 days from now or whenever, we wanted you to be here, and we wanted you to continue to grow and stay with PLG and have a career.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Appreciate it, Mike.
So we have a few minutes left. So I guess to wrap up, I have like one final question for both of you. So for everybody here on the call, they joined because they are interested in figuring out how they can use onboarding, right, and to improve their overall operations. What advice would you give them, to the operators and the HR folks here, who are like, where should they start? What kind of things that you think would be really valuable for them to keep stay top of mind? Jessica, you want to go first?
I will go first. So I'd say first and foremost, onboarding is a cross-functional effort, right? And I can't stress that enough. And I think that there needs to be a solid partnership with operations, with safety, and with HR, because a lot of these, these are all components that are, from everybody's different functional expertises. And creating solid weekly, whether it's weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly meetings to talk about these things, so that they're not just talked about once or twice a year, but that they're a constant subject of discussion. And so setting up a cadence to make these programs a priority, I think, is very, very important. Mike?
I touched on this a little bit, and I was thinking about this as we were wrapping up, because I figured, Francis, you were going to ask this question. One size, again, I'm going to say this again, one size doesn't fit everyone, number one. You've got to do it in a way that works well for your organization. The only thing I can say is, whatever you do, make it consistent. Whether it's, a half day, whether it's a week, whatever it is, but make sure that somebody coming through the door on August 1st is getting the same experience as the person coming through on October 1st. And get as many folks, I guess the other thing I would say is, get as much feedback from your new hires, right? What are you doing that's working? What resonated with them? And maybe what didn't? Did you skip over something? And take the time maybe at the beginning to explain to them and talk to folks about why they're with you in the first place. We're really good as leaders because we try to be as efficient as we can, and we hammer home the what. What do we need you to do? How do we need you to do it? But we're not as good probably on the why. Why are you here? Why are you vital to our organization? And why do we want you to stay here and continue to grow with us? And I think if you can hammer home those things, I think it'll really help your program.
That's really great advice from both of you. If I'm going to try to summarize on the fly, I think from Jessica, it's cross-functional stakeholdership, right? Just making sure every party is involved and that it's not a one-time thing, it's a regular drumbeat. I mean, from Mike, it's whatever it is, do it consistently and make sure you're really listening to your front lines and getting that feedback. So I think with that, we're right on the hour. Thank you, Jessica and Mike, for being so gracious with your insights today, especially with answering everybody else's questions, and for those who participated. And I hope you got one or two nuggets from this, and hope we can see you in a future session with Ed and Stork.
Thanks, Francis.
Everyone.
And I hope, Francis, the only thing I would ask is if anybody has anything that they want to continue to share with onboarding, I'd love to keep the dialogue going beyond today, because if nothing else, I'd love to, what do they say? Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? So I'd love to borrow what other people are doing that's working.
Absolutely.